Good day. Hi, I'm Naveen Zutshi, CIO and SVP at Palo Alto Networks. Today we are having another session of Cloud Conversations. And I'm really pleased to welcome a friend of mine, Yousuf Khan, CIO at Pure Storage. Yousuf, you are one of the first CIO, you're the first CIO at Pure, but you have done that many times over. So someone who has brought companies, who has come into companies as the first CIO and taken them to that scale. And also, you have been an amazing advocate for Pure Storage in terms of your customers and talking to your customers about the challenges that they face and how Pure can help them. So I'm really pleased to have you here.
Thank you for having me. It's fantastic.
Well, let me start with something interesting that we were talking about before. You were talking about something about sweater vests and defense mechanism. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because I see you in a beautiful sweater vest, but I don't often wear sweater vests, so.
Well, I mean, look, the fact that you called it a beautiful sweater vest in itself, those words have never been heard ever in the tech industry. So I want to thank you from the NSA, which is the National Sweater Vest Association, for your kind words. No, in all seriousness, a small background is that it seems to be a very helpful look. And so, I've always, when I first moved to the Bay Area, a large part of it was what's the best attire to come to work that could also represent your company. And orange shirts is probably not something that I'm cool enough to pull off. And so I figured out that a sweater vest with the logo of a company that I genuinely love is something that I aspire to. But yes, it is. I'm trying to be helpful. Is probably the best way to explain it.
Is this a new trend you have adopted? Because I've seen you in jackets before.
The jackets are definitely rentals. So that's a different. Well, I'll let you know what that app is. But
mine is a rental too, probably.
My compliments on yours. My compliments.
Thank you.
Pull that off, basically. I think the other thing is, honestly, I feel that sometimes it's a defense mechanism. You're the CIO walking around a fast-growing company. You never know what people are basically thinking about their last IT issue, and so maybe before they get angry, they see a guy wearing a sweater vest and they're like, maybe I should just calm down. You can not get mad at a guy wearing a sweater vest. So hopefully it's aided me in my career so far. So so far so good.
I'll have to try that out before someone punches me, right?
I'll keep that in mind. Yes, absolutely.
All right. So let's talk about something that is the two most overused words in the IT industry right now, besides artificial intelligence. The two most overused: digital transformation,
of course,
and cloud.
Yes.
So while they are overused, they are incredibly important to the life of the CIO, but more to the businesses themselves. So speak to me as to how are you thinking about these two terms, and in what context have you taken that journey at Pure Storage?
So specifically with cloud, I think what I've basically seen and heard from a number of my peers is, you've got to be very sensible in terms of being very thoughtful and deliberate about deploying out a cloud strategy. A large part of that is knowing that there's a lot of data that basically sits within those applications which sit in the cloud, number one. Number two, what are the benefits that you and your IT organization get from having a cloud strategy? And probably the most important piece is, how does it help the business achieve a reasonable outcome? And that kind of where it kicks in from being cloud, being part of your digital transformation. Like having a transformation, having a strategy, but having it derived towards outcomes is probably one of the most important aspects of it. And then, there's a whole overarching aspect about, well, hey, the security around the cloud, right? And how you're able to do it. I mean, this business probably better than I do. Not probably, definitely better than I do. But a large part of the cloud conversation really needs to be about cost. It needs to be about compliance and security. It needs to be about agility. And then it needs to basically be about the data that sits in the cloud, because I think businesses are being driven by data. And so I want to combine the two, because the cloud strategy allows you to be able to have SaaS applications in place, but I fundamentally believe that we will live in a multi-cloud world for many years to come, and that you will see, and we've seen this with our customers, and I see this amongst peers, is that you have a solid need for integrating multiple clouds. Number one, integrating for SaaS with on-prem in a hybrid cloud strategy, being able to orchestrate data. So I fundamentally believe that we'll be living in a multi-cloud world for many, many years to come, and that's going to be a centerpiece for the CIO. As to AI, well, yes, it's buzzword again. I think my biggest advice to CIOs is you got to do your homework, right? I think, as I've tried to explain to a lot of people, the cloud is actually built on hardware. That's a shock for a lot of people. But it's built up of storage and security appliances. It's built on networks.
Someone else's data center.
And somebody else's data center, right? And so SaaS companies are powered by that. And so the reason I basically mentioned that is the cloud generates a lot of data for you in your enterprise. But with AI specifically, there's just an exponential level of data being generated, not just from a cloud strategy, but just from your business strategy, right? You are deploying out sensors and IoT. You're building more software, which is generating data. You've got more security data that you're putting into place. And so the opportunity for AI is just like the cloud is built on hardware, AI is built on lots and lots of data. And you need to be able to store that data and process it and make sense of it. And I think that's the opportunity for AI. And of course, applying all the logic and algorithms towards it is probably the power of AI, but it all needs to reside on lots and lots and lots of data, basically.
Okay. Let's talk about something you mentioned through this thread is business outcomes. So take Pure Storage as an example. Highly successful on the on-prem world, enormous growth, but seeing the transition now and navigating the transition from this multi-cloud world, as you mentioned, to that transition. So a two-part question. One is, how is the company making that transition? And then second is, how is IT and the CIO helping the company through those outcomes? What are those outcomes that you're looking for as a company? And then how is the CIO helping with those outcomes?
Right. So you mentioned earlier in your very generous introduction that I've been the first CIO 3 times over.
Yeah.
Right? And the easiest way to explain that is a very character building experience.
Right.
You kind of join this company, you're like, do we really need one? I don't know. This guy wears a sweater vest. What's up with this guy, right? And so you get hired in, but in all seriousness, you're organizing positive momentum, right? And so there's 2 things that I've basically seen with respect to how the company, as a result, has gone towards this momentum. We've had, phenomenal growth as a company. We've got a great culture. We've really been a differentiator in this space. And so, one of the things that we definitively see with customers as well as with IT is that the use of a new way of storage and the architecture around it is what really is a winning formula for a lot of companies. And so the reason that I really like my job is I don't have any storage issues, right? That's not a bad, that's a pretty good, nice outcome to have. So when I joined, one of the things I basically found is that a lot of issues that I had in previous jobs with respect to storage technologies, I was able to rethink about this because that was no longer a factor that I had to consider. And I was actually very thoughtful and being very focused by speaking to our product and engineering team to be able to say, okay, let's look at the solutions that we need to be able to have. I mean, if you look at, for example, taking our security log data, if you think about log data not just coming from things like Splunk, but from Palo Alto Networks and other solutions, being able to store and correlate that at a much faster rate than you would have in previous was something that we were able to basically do. I think that one of the trends I'm typically seeing in my job, as well as with other peers, is we're being overwhelmed by data, right? And I think this kind of, and it becomes a bit of a challenge, but you're kind of saying, how do I make sense of all of this? How do I build out an AI practice or AI algorithms to empower that and to improve my product? But how do I have a much better business? When you talk about outcomes, that's about just making better decisions and faster decisions in a very highly competitive space. And so I think from an IT perspective, I've been able to benefit by having a world-class team who've been able to have a world-class product and putting that together and actually really testing it to its full extent. And when I speak to customers and share those stories, we have hundreds of SaaS customers who use our product. And the reason they do that is because they get good support or they get good uptime, but they're able to really make sense of being able to have a much better operation. And so those are the 2 things that I've seen as kind of a unifying factor where high uptime, high customer retention, high customer satisfaction, both internally for an IT organization and then also for a customer with a customer-facing viewpoint.
That makes a lot of sense. That's very well put, especially the notion around SaaS companies that are adopting your technology for their data center needs, right? Let's talk about, you mentioned 3 different CIO jobs where you were the first gig in. The CEO probably didn't understand the difference. And so what were the first 90 days like? What lessons did you learn or distill from those 3 companies to where you can share with other CIOs who are listening to this podcast or watching us on video in terms of what are the key lessons that that they should adopt in the first 90 days, and what mistakes should they avoid?
Well, so I think one thing that most CIOs don't do enough is actually connecting with their peers, right? And so I've been very lucky that you've been very generous with your time with me when I've reached out and you've sort of given that guidance and counsel. Sometimes it's group therapy, but
right, often is. Often is.
From me than you, by the way. But that helps, right? And so I think one lesson I would definitely give is be able to build out a CIO community, which I've been doing that with a lot of deliberation, a lot of focus. I think the second thing is focus on the common denominator, right? When you join as the first CIO for a company, there's always going to be probably 2 or 3 core things which everybody is either concerned about or care about or candidly speaking frustrated with. And that's really come about because the company's grown and there hasn't been any focus on it. Now they've hired a CIO who's going to focus on that effort. If you figure out what the common denominator is, figure out what the solution for that is and drive towards the solution. And probably the third thing is, really define what sort of leader you want to basically be. Right, I think this is the mistake that most people tend to basically make. As I said, this is my 3rd stint, and I'd like to think I'd take the lessons learned from the previous one and bring it into the next one. Is figure out what sort of CIO you want to be, what sort of leader do you want to basically be, what sort of signals do you want to send to your organization and to your team about the type of how you drive action. Number one, how do you make decisions? How do you, get a team together to be able to be motivated? I mean, those things, and it's a very slippery slope. And if you don't do that right, I was very lucky, very, very lucky that I joined a company where they had a very positive culture, continues to have people who are very attracted to it, not just to the brand, but about what we're doing and the mission that we basically have. And so when I joined that, I felt enthused about being able to, collaborate more and connect more with my business. Not all environments provide that. And so I think, most CIOs, they have a lot of focus towards, I need to fix this or I need to focus on this. Take a little bit of a step back and figure out the type of CIO you want to be, because there's a lot of your peers and a lot of your partners, business partners in the organization are saying, can we go to this individual for our problems or not? And so I think that's one of the things that I took to mind.
Yeah, that's a very insightful thing to say. I've been thinking about this, the 4 personas of a CIO. Could be an innovation officer, could be an intelligent officer, integration officer, or information officer, or an information officer. Yeah, accidental CIO. And you could all have those 4 hats. You could be wearing all 4 hats at one time or the other. What do you think your persona is? What is your natural fit?
Ooh, good question. Good question. I think I'd probably be a bit of a hybrid of the two. I think I'd probably center on a couple of things. One is I'd like to be more centered towards decision making and driving decisions, and so that seems to be a little bit more of my tact in terms of my focus. I have a huge focus towards innovation. I partner up, with and look at startups on a regular basis, and I look at connecting up with VCs from time to time to figure out what they're basically seeing. And so that's my sort of innovation piece where I'd like to basically have that. And, you always want to question your assumptions of the industry and what you've been doing to see how you can improve. I think the other piece is, you focus on kind of where the business is going and to be able to make sure that connected. And I think the perennial challenge that most CIOs have is, they can, I think the successful CIOs, and I'm still working towards that, are the ones who are much more connected to the business. And so what I'm able to do, and the reason that I think my job is good, and I think similar to yours, is you can actually put yourselves in the shoes of the customer and say what that customer needs. And so I've been able to build out, a pure story where we've been able to use our product and use it for multiple use cases where a lot of my peers would be able to do it. And some of those is not even solutions that we typically sold. It was just that we did a lot of discovery, connected with a number of. We're like, wow, our product works in so many different use cases. We should be able to build that out. And so that part, connected to the business, being operational but decisive is probably, and then the third one being focused towards innovation. So I'm kind of, I would toggle between those two. Is kind of where I would focus. Yeah.
That's a good way of describing it.
It's a work in progress, by the way.
It's a work in progress for all of us. It's a work in progress for all of us. And I think that's part of the fun actually,
Yeah,
because
totally.
we are learning animals.
Yeah.
And this opportunity, the CIO position gives you that opportunity to actually learn at speed.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah, I'm a big learner. I mean, that's one of my pieces. I don't consider myself remotely smart, but I'm just someone who can basically take in and ingest a lot of knowledge and try and basically make sense out of it. So I do far too much reading for my own good, but of really, really geeky, nerdy stuff.
what is the recent book you have read?
Recent book I read was I'm more historical. I don't read fiction. I only read nonfiction, and that's on sort of historical books. So the most recent one was read about a car, which was talked about the history of the car industry, and specifically around the big car manufacturers in the U.S. and kind of the up and downs that they basically had. And so I'm always fascinated by how a lot of these industries have either been disrupted and the turnaround of how businesses operate and kind of what drives those basically.
That's fascinating because it's on automobile industry. Is Tesla a computer company or is it a car company? You could debate that too.
Right. Well, I mean, if you think about it, a lot of our peer group, when you speak to the CIOs and digital transformation, where a lot of these companies are heading towards, not just automotive but others, it's really interesting because they have gone into this way. They are being much more customer centric than ever before, and I think that's really because that user experience, the customer experience, is just so overly demanding, right? If you spoke to the CIO of an airline recently, they said, well, we're a customer service company. We just happen to fly airplanes. And, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to revolutionize the check-in experience. And they're trying to basically use the mobile app more to be able to do it. And they say, well, the plane is just part of it. If you think about insurance companies, for example, they're trying to deploy out drones to take petabytes of images. And so they can point that back and to be able to do claim checks a lot faster, right? And so that digital transformation story will continue to evolve, and that will change how companies view themselves. And I think, to your point, automotive companies also look at themselves a little bit different. Like, are we more technology or more traditional auto? But yeah.
Yeah. So let's get back to that topic in a little while. Yeah. I want to get back to some of the things that you mentioned on innovation and cloud.
Yes.
So if you take cloud security as an example, right. Security as a general term maybe applied differently in the cloud than it's on-prem. Maybe there are differences. In your mind, what are the key differences? What do you see are the differences in the cloud versus on-prem? And then how have you thought about cloud security?
So I think one of the things I look at security much more from an aspect, I just think much more broadly about it. And so I try not to determine things between on-prem and SaaS. I think, what I basically focus towards is having the right pillars from a security standpoint, right? And so by that, I take a viewpoint of saying, what do we do at the endpoint, right, to what we do at the perimeter? And I think, and then at the application base, how we basically are able to secure each of these, right? Now, a large part of this is having a balance between how it impacts productivity and then how you're able to make sure that you don't compromise on the security. And I think that's the balancing act that we're able to basically do, right? And so I actually look at security in the cloud from a very broad perspective, number one. Number two, I think it's a lot about actually the posture that you want to be able to drive, right? Whether it's, what are you trying to solve for? Right? So if you look at a large part of cloud security and what you're able to do there, a large part of that is focused towards data. A large part of security awareness is much more about the individual and social engineering. A large part of when you deploy out endpoint solutions is about being able to protect both on the data side, but looking at different techniques that basically does that, right? And so I think you just have to be a little bit more thoughtful about prioritizing across those threat vectors and then being deliberate and dialing into specific strategies across each of those. That's my kind of broad viewpoint. I think the other piece is the investigation, the forensic piece is really important. And so, one of the things that you basically can do, I like what Palo Alto have done, right? You've in my viewpoint as a customer, what I've typically seen is you've focused it tightly, you've understood an IT ecosystem, and you've said, how do we integrate well within that ecosystem that sits within an IT organization, and how do we make it easy for the customers? And so, as a happy customer, thank you. But that basically means that you've made a lot of people's lives easier from an InfoSec team standpoint or a system admin standpoint, because you've actually thought about the context of the customer in its full environment. You're like, okay, how do we integrate with what they have to be able to improve the security of the environment? And so that's one of the things which most people miss. They look at buying a number of solutions and a number of tools. I don't tend to agree with that approach. I actually think you need to say, what are my threat vectors? A cloud security, on-prem, data, compliance, and others. And how do I basically optimize my existing environment? And so, Palo Alto, for example, you release new features, you do new integrations, you think much more broadly. That's something that customers like us really, really like. And so we like to try and do the same with our product when we look at our customers. Does that help?
Thank you. One for the plug-in plug into our product. More importantly, I think the comments you made around security architecture and security platform, and that should tie into your IT platform is prescient, is very important. I think the key pieces, from my point of view, the notion of access, perimeters everywhere, the notion of protecting that, having complete visibility to all aspects, and then being able to detect between known and unknown threats. And then from a posture standpoint, having this prevention-oriented posture doesn't mean that you don't do the detection and response. You need both of those, but if you have a strong prevention-oriented posture, it will help you reduce the number of detection events and response events. And I think you need to do that both in on-prem and cloud. I think one of the things that we see is differences, as an example, on the cloud side is, especially on the public IaaS cloud side, is there is an increased need for tying security within the automation framework itself of the DevOps. Now, having to said that, even on private cloud, that is the same exact notion. You must be seeing it on the private cloud side as well. Is driving automation is key, and then security as an adjunct function, while important, needs to be permeated throughout the organization. And that makes some differences in both the tools you select, the automation technologies you have, the kind of people you have, and the way you build the process. So that's one of the things we are seeing, like this whole notion of how does DevSecOps really come into fruition. It's not an organization as such, it's more of a process. How do you make that happen? Any thoughts on that? Any work that you are doing at Pure from a private cloud standpoint, or from a SaaS visibility standpoint that you would like to share?
Sure, I can talk to that. So one common notion that I'd like to aspire toward is you need to monitor kind of everything, right? You care about the data in your applications, you care about the data in your environment, and so monitoring around that is absolutely critical. But the other thing is that you've got to come up with some core, assumptions. Assumption number one is that actually it's really hard to get productivity within a security operation if the threat vectors are increasing much more faster than your organization, right? That's just a harsh reality that you need to focus on.
Our CEO calls it the inverse math problem.
Right. I just call it a problem that you need to deal with, right? And so I think one of the things as a result, there's a bit of a forcing function, right? And that forcing function is about how you're able to, just like as an IT organization, you're trying to scale and build more automation in your services, right? About application provisioning and just, IT support and business application support. The same needs to be applied to your security organization, right? And so, for example, you need to be able to think about the fact that if you're going to have a larger ingest of data coming into your security organization, how are you able to process that and make sense out of it, and to be able to come up with a security strategy based on those data points? Now, I'm lucky because I've got a great storage infrastructure which allows me to be able to process that data, and it runs really well, for example, on Splunk, right? I'm able to basically do correlation searches and indexing around it. If you look at, and so what I would basically talk about is the evolving of automation in the security space. The first phase of that happened over the last couple of years. The next phase is going to be driven by AI, and that really is going to be required. As I talked about making faster decisions, that's where AI is actually going to be able to play a part. Because if you agree that the threat vectors are only going to get more complex, if you agree that the level of data from those threats, malicious or otherwise, is also going to infest, you need to be able to be much more productive by having automation in your security infrastructure to be able to do so, right? And I think that applies across the board. So I think that's a basic fundamental from a SecOps perspective. And that therefore applies from a dev perspective. I think on the DevOps and SecDevOps, as we call it, to your point, I think it's a culture. I think it's a way that organizations have been able to combine and be more agile and be able to be more respond to business requirements. I think that's really going to be around monitoring a large infrastructure, making sense of it, and securing it, right, and putting that together. But automating it at the foundation stone. I think that's going to be the next iteration for it.
Yeah, I think this triangle of security, increased presence of security everywhere, driving more data needs and storage needs by that means,
Right.
and then that driving more machine learning to further refine the security algorithms is a really nice virtuous triangle you can make. Right. And so that's an interesting way to think about it. We have been investing a lot in that area as well, and as do other security companies. So I think that's a really well put thesis together. So let's go to other topics around the CIO itself. So if you put on your thinking cap for the future,
Yes.
Where do you think the CIO role is evolving into in the next 2 to 5 years?
2 to 5 years?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I can look at 5 years, but I'll try 2. Right? I think a large focus of the role is really focusing on organizing data in the organization. Right? I think the role of things like chief data officers and is not it's definitely not something which is extremely popular, right? I mean, most companies, the data strategies in a lot of companies is still very, very fragmented. And so I think the opportunity of the CIO is to be able to organize that, just like they've organized technology, just like in a lot of cases they're organizing innovation and they're organizing operations. I think they're going to be able to organize data a lot more. I'm actually seeing that already. I play a small part of that in my company, where I'm able to partner up with a number of our leadership to be able to figure out what data is required and be able to provide effectively a data platform to do it. So I think I definitely see that, and I think that's a huge need for it. I think the second role of the CIO is definitively much more focused on the customer experience. Probably even more so than before, and not just because you're a CIO of a tech company, but just looking at, and so most of the CIOs that I've spoken to, either in passing or at events or group therapy sessions or dinners otherwise, right? There's definitively a much more focus about enabling a much better customer experience, and by saying, okay, how do we, I'll give you an example. So our NPS score as a company is, one of the highest in the industry, if not the highest. And I work with our VP of Global Support on a regular basis. And so what I'm trying to do there is to basically say, how do we optimize the support experience for our customers? What is the best way for them to be able to, and then I take that same thinking and I work with our channel organization and say, okay, how do we make it easy for our channel partners to be able to transact and work with us? And then I also and then I look at our own internal customers and say, okay, how do I aid the marketing organization? So I think this kind of customer focus point is going to be a large part of it, where CIOs are probably going to be hired into these companies, be able to say, okay, look, we've built out a good operational foundation. I want you to be able to now transform that customer experience. I see that role evolving in those two very, very big strands, but both of those combine for better business outcomes. So that's the way I basically view it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I would extend it to a third area, which is, so in a tech company, those are really important because we are already a digital company. Both of us are digital companies, so it's not as if we are looking for a digital transformation.
Absolutely.
But however, in many companies, that disruption is either happening or is in the process of happening.
Yeah.
And I think either the CIO or whoever is in the technology function plays that critical role in defining the business strategy with the company leaders.
Right.
And those CIOs or those lead technologists who can adapt, embrace that, and help the business, help that transformation, will be very effective in the few following years. And others who won't will not only be ineffective, but I think their companies won't be either.
Right.
And so I think this growing realization within management teams that CIO plays a pivotal role in terms of helping you transform business strategy is increasingly being felt.
Right.
because of the looming changes and the disruptions that you talked about that are happening all around us.
Right. So if we take the example of where we've gone through a digital transformation, or we were born in digital transformation, if you think about it, other businesses are going through the business transformation, right? They're literally trying to uplift their business because they're in a highly competitive industry, right? Or they've all of a sudden being disrupted in some way, shape, or form. So the role of that CIO is really to be able to help put a lot of that strategy and architecture together, probably even more so than before. And the reason it's different this time is because the cloud has enabled that individual to be able to do so, right? They've got the emergence of building out a great data infrastructure on-prem. They've got the ability to work with SaaS companies. They look at an overarching strategy to be able to put all of this together, architect it, and then help transform that business. So I think that's I think you'll probably continue to see more and more of that as in the role of the CIO, because they'll just be much better connected, simply because the possibilities are there. Now you can we didn't look at drones or sensors many years ago. It wasn't even in our thought process, and now we're having IoT strategies that we're basically building in place. So I think it's going to be exciting times, at least definitely for the CIO roles.
Let me finish this off, and one last question for you is, what is the word of advice for emerging VPs or young folks who are now coming into the IT field?
Yeah.
Maybe a two-part question. Let me phrase it differently.
So just confirm you don't think I'm young. Okay, that's fine.
Let me phrase the question different.
Thank you.
New students coming in to IT.
Sure.
What word of advice do you have for them? How should they look at coming into the IT organization, and what should they be learning in future to help them succeed in this field?
If I look back, I think both at my career and learning from people who are, CEOs or heads of sales, otherwise, there's a couple of common threads that I came up with. But I apply that specifically for people wanting to be successful in IT and entering in the IT field, who are VPs of IT or IT directors. I think it's a couple of things. I think the first thing is you really have to be curious about technology. I think if you're not, then I don't think it's something that you could do longer term, because I think, and the reason for that is it's growing at such a massive pace. It's really important to not just be sort of kept up to date so you know what the latest buzzword is. It's actually about where is it driving value, right? And so the importance to be able to be curious about that is really important. I think from a skills and personality aspect, I think there's just a general notion, like, build self-awareness. I think self-awareness is a skill, right? Know what you're really good at and understanding where you can add value and know where you're not. And I think just a lot of people don't do that. The third thing I would say is be very good at listening. There's probably more listening to be done in my job than before, because there is so much more going on, and processing this and actually making sense is probably an important thing. And probably the fourth thing is, and I got this advice many years and I still apply it right now, is learn how the business operates. There's just a lot of, there's one common thing I've basically seen with kind of people who've worked in the IT space, whether CIOs, VPs, or et cetera, is if they don't understand how their business operates, then it's really difficult to actually, be thoughtful, be helpful, come up with a strategy, because you're talking in the abstract, right? And so I just think it's really important that I'm not asking you to be an expert in marketing operations or manufacturing, but I think it's really important to know how that business is connected. It's just really important to know how each of these functions operate. And so, because fundamentally, if we agree that software is really dominating the world in a lot of ways, right, in more ways than we can basically count, then let's understand that that's a possibility and a real opportunity for someone working in IT to be improving their organizations. But you can only do that if you actually know what each of those organizations are doing. And so that's the last piece of advice, because a lot of people, I just think they're just very disconnected. They're like, okay, I'm going to do this, and I'm like, okay, well, think a little bit more broadly about how this impacts everyone. And so knowing how the business operates, knowing how companies run in the context of the industry, like how customers, like that is an important exercise to do.
So if I had to summarize, know thyself.
Know thyself.
Second is be intensely curious, whether it's business or IT or technology, right? And I think there is some value around be results oriented.
Yeah.
It's a delivery oriented organization, and I think some folks lose that. One of the best lessons I've learned is talk is cheap. Ultimately, results matter.
Right.
And how you produce those results matter as well.
Right.
But having that combination of both being able to produce results and producing them well in a team setting is equally important.
I think the last thing is you've got to be optimistic.
Yeah.
I mean,
Half full.
look at the possibilities
Yes,
that are
amazing.
out there, right?
It's an
The
amazing
ability
place.
to create, software, build out a product, and put it to market, and actually, that's the story that has encapsulated a lot of minds, right? Because it's not longer the art of the possible; it literally is the possible. It is, and so I think a lot of people have traditionally come into the approach in our industry. Well, oh, that can't work. Oh, that can't happen for X, Y, and Z reason, right? And actually, I think those barriers are down because there's a lot more possible than you would think. We just need to be a little bit more thoughtful about it.
Even when I joined computer science and my first job, that was the main reason that excited me.
Right.
Was the notion of I could learn, but use that learning to solve a specific problem and actually create something.
Right.
And that creating something is always an amazing feeling.
Right.
I don't know, like as managers, you don't get that level of rush that you get as a developer.
Right.
When you are constantly creating something.
Right. Yeah.
So having that creative mindset of solving business problems or solving technical problems is a key trait.
Absolutely.
For engineers.
Very, very possible. I think if people approach that, when they come in, especially, in the time that we're living in right now, I think you're really set up for success.
You know what, Yousuf, it was a pleasure.
Thank you.
So much good conversations. Let's keep that going. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the company. We are a customer of yours, and as you are of ours, so it's a great conversation to just have among peers.
Thank you very, very much.
Yeah.
All right. Appreciate it.
Okay.